Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's time for us to move into our next period, literary movement, which is federalism. This is the time of the Enlightenment, which is also called the Age of Reason. So these could be some interchangeable terms for us. And just as before, when we look at dates, they're really just kind of placeholders on the different movements, because there's a clear overlap between Puritanism and federalism. The perfect example of this is that Jonathan Edwards and Benjamin Franklin were alive at the same time. So that's important to remember, especially about anything with history, is that rarely is there a clear beginning and ending. So with all that said, let's talk about the influential thinker for federalism, and it is John Locke. John Locke was not an American. He was on the continent of Europe, and he had an incredible influence on the founding fathers of America. And when we talk about the founding fathers of America, these are Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington. These are the founding fathers. They contributed the documents such as the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They worked towards achieving those goals as well as being involved in the Revolution. These are the founding fathers, and they're associated during this time period. So, John Locke, what he believed in was empiricism. He was opposed to the belief in innate ideas, and he believed that the mind was tabula rasa, which is a blank slate. And with tabula rasa, we're born into the world a blank slate, empty. And then as we age and we go through life, we pick up more knowledge. It becomes written on our slate. And this happens mechanically through the sense organs. In other words, the good way to think about this is, how does a child realize that he or she should not put his or her hand upon a hot stove? Well, the child's mom or dad could tell the child not to do that. But as we all know, the best way to learn is to experience things. So when you were little and you reached up and you got your hand burned, you learned instantly not to do it again, right? Now, empiricism, this is pretty much science. This is the scientific method. We learn through experience, observation. Science is incredibly influential and popular during the Enlightenment. It's one of the touchstones. Now, John Locke, in addition to being a scientist, was also a philosopher, especially in political theory. He was the leading philosopher of freedom, and this seems really strange to us today, that people would not be an advocate for freedom. But when during this time, during the Enlightenment, the 1700s, freedom, liberty, these were kind of new concepts, new ideas. So Locke came up with a very influential statement that should sound familiar, and that was that all human beings were equal and free to pursue life, health, liberty, and possessions. And that sounds a lot like what's written down in the Declaration of Independence. That's because Thomas Jefferson was a student. He read widely from John Locke, and he basically was parroting these ideas of life, health, liberty, and possessions. So John Locke, his political theories also yielded in the U.S. Constitution the system of checks and balances. And here's an interesting thing that we get from John Locke, is that revolution in some circumstances is not only a right, but an obligation. So in other words, he said, there's certain times where people have to revolt. We just cannot sit still and suffer the loss of our liberties. And John Locke was also a big proponent of religious freedom. So again, John Locke, he's the influential thinker, the major influence of the Enlightenment for the Federalists, as he epitomizes the Enlightenment's faith in the middle class, science, and human goodness. So continuing, science. Just to give some little snapshots here of what's going on. Isaac Newton, of course, gravity had been around. It's always funny when people say he discovered gravity. Someone had discovered gravity eons and eons before, but he was able to come up with the equations for it. Something crazy about Sir Isaac Newton, he came up with calculus. Can you imagine sitting down and inventing calculus? And also discovered that white light has every color in the spectrum. Like if you get a prism and you hold it up into a beam of light, and then it divides out into the colors of the rainbow. Yeah, thank you, Sir Isaac Newton, for that. Also worked with universal gravity, came up with 3 laws of motion, talked about the governance, how they interplayed with each other to come up with the governing laws for planets and their satellites, the motion of comets, tides, all this mind-boggling stuff. And he also built the first reflecting telescope. Wow, and this crazy stuff, and he didn't even have computers back then. So I know, everybody's thinking, so what, Mr. K? Well, it's important to remember, guys, we just left the Puritans, right? Very, very godly people who one of their purposes in writing was to demystify God through commonplace events. Now we reach the Federals, the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, science. And what they're seeking to do is to explain God's mysteries through a new science, one that has concrete applications. Now, what's significant here is that during the Enlightenment, they viewed science as a way to understand God. So by studying science, they were studying how God works in the world. And this is, scientists during the Enlightenment had a different take on things compared to scientists today. And I'm not knocking science by any means, and I don't mean to cast, a broad net, but a lot of scientists today are atheists or agnostic, say that there is no such thing as God, it's a human construct. But during this time, during the Enlightenment, by studying science, we learn about God and about how God works in our world. So now, we need to touch upon some history, because we're leading up to the American Revolution. The population starts to increase and becomes such a sizable number that Mother England really cannot, this is something to pay attention to. Then, another thing that we have is what today we call sectionalism. How the 13 colonies divided themselves, not formally, they didn't get together and do this, but it was based upon their economies. So as you go through and you read this slide, you'll see that the different divisions are based upon economies. And we'll be focusing on the middle colonies, because this is where we have the Federalists, the Founding Fathers. Everything is pretty much happening here in the middle colonies. So, when we talk about the American Revolution, it didn't happen like that. It took a while for it to get geared up. And one of the principal causes of the American Revolution, of course, what we're familiar with is taxation without representation, and that was done through different acts, such as the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, and the Stamp Act. So all of these, the Sugar Act, all these different ones, these were ways that the colonists were taxed. And of course, they had no say-so in this. So taxes have always been something of great concern for Americans. So we'll continue with the overview in the next lecture.